Welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be exploring Robert T. Kaplan's The Tragic Mind, Fear, Fate, and the Burden of Power.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one. Kaplan, he's a longtime foreign correspondent, spent 40 years covering all these global conflicts and crises.
Yeah, he's been in the thick of it.
Yeah. And what I find particularly interesting about his work is that he was initially a supporter of the Iraq War, but later he came to deeply regret that stance. And I think that really informs his whole perspective.
It's an evolution you see with a lot of folks who have that much experience on the ground.
Exactly. And so we're going to kind of dive into how his concept of this tragic mind can help us navigate what feels like a pretty complex world these days.
Especially in today's world. I mean,
Right.
We're just bombarded with information, strong opinions everywhere you turn.
Yeah. How do we make sense of it all? And Kaplan, I think, offers some really interesting insights. So one of the things that kind of jumped out at me right away was this connection he makes between geography and Shakespeare.
Oh.
He says, understanding world events starts with maps, but ends with Shakespeare.
Now, how do you figure that?
Right. Seems like a strange pairing, but I think he's onto something. What do you think?
Well, it has to do with, the layers of understanding. So geography sets the stage. It gives us the physical realities, the resources, the limitations of different regions, right? But it's the human drama. It's what unfolds within those, geographic constraints that really drives history. You know what I mean?
So that's where Shakespeare comes in.
That's where Shakespeare comes in.
Yeah.
Exactly. He's getting at those timeless themes, the ambition, the fear, the betrayal, all the stuff that shapes human choices ultimately shapes the world.
So it's not just about borders and resources.
No, it's about people. It's about how we interact, how we make decisions, how we screw things up.
Yeah, the human element. And I think that's what makes his work so compelling. Because he doesn't just talk about these things in the abstract. He draws on his own experiences too, right?
Mm-hmm.
He spent time reporting in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which I just reading about it is terrifying.
Oh, absolutely.
What was he thinking?
Well, this was back in the 1980s, and Kaplan was right there witnessing the brutality, the oppression of Saddam's regime.
Just imagine.
It was a chilling experience, really impacted his view of geopolitics. I mean, really made him appreciate the value of order, even if that order is, imperfect.
Right, because he's arguing that while tyranny is awful, complete anarchy is actually even worse.
Exactly. He saw that firsthand, not just in Iraq, but in Sierra Leone, other conflict zones he covered. I mean, think about it.
So it's about choosing the lesser of two evils.
Sometimes. It's a tragic choice, right?
Definitely has those tragic mind vibes. And it's interesting how he connects this idea of order versus chaos to the Greek god Dionysus.
Interesting connection.
Dionysus represented those primal, unruly forces.
Oh, totally.
Right. This stuff that's always trying to disrupt order.
And think about how that resonates today, right? I mean, look around. Everything feels kind of chaotic. Social media, political polarization, the potential for conflict between superpowers.
It's everything's kind of on edge.
It's we're living in this modern day expression of that age-old struggle between order and chaos.
And how do we deal with that? How do we make sense of such a messy world? Because it seems like even when people try to do the right thing, it can backfire so easily. It's like those classic Greek tragedies. Take Oedipus. He's trying to avoid this terrible prophecy.
Yeah.
And ends up fulfilling it anyway.
Oh, such a good story.
I know. It's so frustrating.
But so powerful. It illustrates just how little control we really have.
Right. You can have the best intentions, make what you think are the right choices, and still end up causing suffering.
Yes.
Is there even such a thing as a right choice?
And then you've got Antigone, torn between obeying the law and her moral duty to her family.
An impossible situation.
Right. These stories, they're not just entertainment. They're about those tough choices and unintended consequences that Kaplan is talking about.
It's they're giving us a framework for understanding the tragic mind.
Exactly. It's the ability to see those potential consequences, to understand that even the right choice, quote unquote, can lead to pain. And yet you still have to have the courage to act. You can't just sit on the sidelines.
You can't be paralyzed by indecision.
Exactly. You have to weigh the options, make the best call you can, and live with the consequences.
Which brings us to ambition. Kaplan talks a lot about how ambition drives progress, but also how it can lead to some pretty destructive decisions, especially for those in power.
Oh yeah, ambition is a double-edged sword. Powerful, but dangerous.
And he uses figures like Brutus and Macbeth to show how ambition, if it's not tempered by something, can become Really dangerous.
Right. I mean, look at Brutus, ambitious for Rome, but ended up contributing to its chaos.
In Macbeth. Classic example of ambition leading to, like, just utter destruction.
Consumed by his desire for power, murder, tyranny. It's a reminder that good intentions, even noble goals, don't automatically lead to good outcomes.
And sometimes those in charge don't really fully grasp the consequences of their actions, especially when it comes to something like war.
War is a different beast altogether.
Kaplan really gets into this because he's seen it all up close and personal. He talks about the physical and mental misery of it all, how different it is from any kind of romanticized version we might have in our heads.
Yeah, he argues that those who haven't experienced war firsthand often have this really distorted view of it. It's easy to see it as this like strategic game on a map, but they don't get the human cost, the sheer horror of it.
And that lack of understanding can lead to terrible, terrible decisions.
Think about the leaders who send troops into combat without truly grasping what they're asking of those soldiers.
Chilling. It really highlights the burden of leadership, doesn't it? And it makes you wonder if we're just doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. Like Kaplan draws this parallel between the Athenian disaster in Sicily and the U.S. experience in Vietnam.
Oh, powerful parallel.
And he connects it to the overreach of the Persian Empire under Xerxes.
Right, powerful nations blinded by their own ambition, overextending themselves, leading to disaster.
So the question becomes, are we heading down that same path? Are we making the same mistakes as those who came before us?
That's the question that keeps me up at night.
Me too. And I think it's something we all need to be thinking about.
Yeah.
Because the stakes are pretty high.
Absolutely. And that's why Kaplan's work is so important. It's a wake-up call, a reminder to approach the world with a sense of caution, a sense of humility.
And maybe even a little bit of fear.
Fear, not as paralysis, but as a guide, a way to keep us grounded, to prevent us from repeating the mistakes of the past. It's a question that weighs heavily on leaders, right? I mean, this fear of repeating past mistakes, being remembered for those choices that caused suffering.
Yeah, and this whole idea of overreach, it doesn't just apply to military interventions, right? Kaplan also talks about this belief that increased trade with China would somehow lead to more political freedom there.
Yeah, that assumption, well, it turned out to be a bit too simplistic, didn't it? It's like they overlooked the deeper cultural and historical forces that shape a nation's path. You know?
We try to impose our own ideas of how things should work.
Right, exactly. It's a reminder that the world doesn't always, conform to our expectations.
Which brings us back to that concept of the tragic mind. It's about understanding that we have limits, that things don't always go according to plan, no matter how good our intentions are.
It's a humbling realization, but a necessary one. Without that humility, without that awareness of, unintended consequences, we're more likely to make those same mistakes, to fall into those traps of overconfidence and overreach.
So it's not about being pessimistic.
No, not at all.
But about being realistic.
Exactly. It's about having a clear-eyed view of reality, understanding that our choices have consequences.
Kaplan also highlights this tension between, different goods, where even well-intentioned actions can have negative consequences. It makes you think about the tough choices leaders face, the dilemmas where there are no easy answers.
It's the essence of tragedy, isn't it? That clash between competing values where there's no painless solution. It's a powerful reminder that ambition, while it can be this driving force, needs to be balanced with something more grounded.
Grounded in reality, in an awareness of our limitations, maybe even in a healthy dose of fear.
Exactly. Kaplan argues that fear, when properly understood, can be a valuable tool.
Not talking about, paralyzing fear.
No, not that kind. But the kind that makes us cautious, that forces us to consider the potential downsides of our actions.
Like a sense of, what did he call it, anxious foresight.
Yes, anxious foresight. It's about thinking several steps ahead, anticipating potential problems, even when we, really hope everything will go smoothly.
So instead of charging ahead blindly,
we pause. We consider the possible outcomes, both good and bad.
we weigh the risks.
Right. It's not about being pessimistic or avoiding action altogether. It's about having this clear-eyed view of reality, understanding that our choices have consequences.
This reminds me of something else Kaplan discusses, the connection between ambition and the state.
Yeah.
He argues that the state itself becomes this breeding ground for ambition.
It's like that famous saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Individuals within the state are constantly vying for power, often at the expense of others.
And it's not just those at the very top. This dynamic plays out throughout the entire system.
It's like this built-in tension.
Yeah, exactly. A struggle for dominance, for control. And Kaplan doesn't shy away from the darker aspects of this. He even suggests that men in particular are drawn to violence, especially within the context of the state.
It's a controversial argument, for sure.
Oh, absolutely. But he's not afraid to, delve into the darker aspects of human nature, the primal instincts that can drive us, even in the supposedly civilized world of politics.
It makes you wonder how we can ensure that those who hold power within the state wield it responsibly. How do we prevent those primal instincts from taking over?
That's the age-old question, isn't it? How do we balance the need for order and security with the protection of individual rights and freedoms? How do we guard against the abuse of power, the temptation to resort to violence?
It's a constant struggle.
It is, and it requires a certain kind of leadership, one that understands the complexity of the world, the limits of human knowledge, the potential for unintended consequences.
Which brings us back to that concept of the tragic mind.
Full circle.
It's not just a way of thinking, it's a way of seeing the world.
It's about acknowledging our limitations, accepting the inevitability of suffering, and yet still choosing to act, even in the face of uncertainty.
I'm starting to see how this applies not just to world leaders, but to all of us. I mean, we all face difficult choices in our own lives, right?
Absolutely. Think about a time when you had to make a decision where every option seemed to have a downside.
Oh yeah, I've been there.
That's the tragic mind at work. Recognizing the complexity of the situation, accepting the potential for pain, and still having the courage to choose.
It's not about finding the perfect solution, because often there isn't one.
Right. It's about making the best choice you can with the information you have, and then accepting the consequences.
Kaplan highlights leaders who embody this tragic sensibility. People like Abraham Lincoln, who bore the weight of the Civil War and made agonizing decisions, knowing that no matter what he chose, there would be tremendous suffering.
And Franklin D. Roosevelt. He made the difficult decision to ally with Stalin, a brutal dictator, to defeat Hitler.
Another impossible choice.
It was a choice between two evils, made with the understanding that there would be a heavy price to pay, regardless of the outcome.
It emphasizes the burden of leadership, making those impossible choices, accepting responsibility for the consequences, and living with the knowledge that even the best intentions can lead to unintended outcomes.
It's a heavy burden to bear, but it applies to decisions big and small, whether they affect nations or just our personal lives.
Kaplan uses the ancient Greek concept of hubris to illustrate this. He talks about Xerxes, the Persian king, whose pride and overconfidence led to his downfall.
Classic case of hubris.
It's a reminder that power without wisdom, without humility, can be a dangerous thing.
And that's the essence of the tragic mind. Recognizing the limits of human control, accepting the inevitability of suffering, and yet choosing to act even in the face of uncertainty and potential failure.
So the big question is, are we, as individuals and as a society, capable of cultivating that tragic sensibility? Do we have the wisdom, the courage, and the humility to navigate this increasingly complex world?
That's the challenge Kaplan leaves us with. He doesn't offer easy answers or simple solutions. Instead, he encourages us to think deeply, to embrace the discomfort of uncertainty, and to develop a tragic awareness of our place in this world. It's a journey of self-discovery and a call to action.
It's definitely a lot to think about, but it feels incredibly relevant to the challenges we're facing today. Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you. It's interesting how Kaplan contrasts the tragic mind with our current, culture, which often rewards those loud and overly confident voices.
It's all about projecting certainty, right? Those who offer those simple solutions to complex problems, they get all the attention.
But Kaplan suggests that true wisdom often lies in recognizing how much we don't know.
Humility is a rare quality these days.
Yeah, and he uses the example of President George H.W. Bush. Remember how he was criticized for his, cautious approach to foreign policy after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Oh yeah, he was seen as weak by some.
Right. He warned against the dangers of unchecked nationalism.
But at the time, everyone was so caught up in the victory, they didn't want to hear it.
And yet in hindsight, especially given what's happening now with Putin in Ukraine, Bush's warnings seem incredibly prescient.
He had that tragic mind. He understood the complexities of the post-Soviet world, anticipated the potential for future conflict.
His cautious approach was actually a sign of wisdom, not weakness.
Exactly. He wasn't afraid to acknowledge the limits of American power, the potential for things to go wrong.
It's a reminder that sometimes the wisest course of action is the one that prioritizes long-term stability, even if it means facing criticism in the short term.
It's about playing the long game, thinking beyond the immediate headlines.
Kaplan also warns against overlearning the lessons of the past.
Oh, yeah, that's a trap we often fall into.
He points out how the trauma of World War I led to this policy of appeasement in the face of Hitler's aggression.
Nobody wanted to repeat the horrors of the trenches, so they tried to avoid confrontation at all costs.
But as we know, that approach backfired spectacularly.
It did, and it highlights the danger of applying the lessons of the past too rigidly.
Every situation is unique, and the tragic mind understands that.
It's not about clinging to the past, but about applying the lessons we've learned to the challenges of the present, with a clear understanding that history doesn't always repeat itself.
So how do we develop this tragic mind? How do we learn to see the world through this lens of complexity and uncertainty?
Kaplan argues that studying history and literature can be incredibly valuable.
Especially for those who haven't experienced the harsh realities of war or political upheaval firsthand.
Exactly. These works offer insights into the minds of those who have wrestled with difficult choices, who have faced the consequences of their actions.
It's about developing empathy then, understanding the human dimension of those grand historical events.
Yes, but it's also about cultivating a sense of perspective. Reading about the challenges and tragedies of the past helps us realize that our own time, with all of its anxieties and uncertainties, is not unique.
We're not alone in facing these struggles.
Not at all. Humans have always grappled with the tension between order and chaos, with the allure of ambition and the need for restraint.
So, by understanding those who came before us,
We can gain valuable insights into our own lives and the choices we face.
we can learn from their mistakes, their triumphs, their wisdom, and their follies.
And hopefully we can use that knowledge to navigate the complexities of our own time with a bit more wisdom, a bit more humility.
That's a powerful message, and one that feels incredibly relevant today as we face the challenges of uncertainty and risk in our own time.
Kaplan's work is a call to action. It urges us to cultivate a more nuanced, a more grounded, a more tragic understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
It's a call to embrace complexity, to acknowledge our limitations, and to act with both courage and humility.
To face the world with open eyes, with a willingness to learn, and with a deep appreciation for the human condition.
Well said. I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the tragic mind. It's been an incredible journey exploring these ideas.
It has, and I hope it sparks some new thoughts, some new perspectives for our listeners.
I hope so too. And remember, it's not about dwelling on negativity or giving into despair. It's about facing the world with clear eyes, with courage, and with a deep understanding of the beauty and the burden of this wondrously complicated existence. Until next time, fellow deep divers, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep embracing the complexities of this world.